Welcome to video 5 in our series. In today's session, we're going to take what we've learned in the last 3 videos and apply it to real-world scenarios. These are practical examples that bring theory to life.
While we'll start with surface-based examples, what we cover today isn't limited to surface mines. It's relevant everywhere. How many times have you walked past a footpath with cracks on the edge or slopes with subtle signs of movement without even realizing what you were seeing? Whether you work on the surface or underground, this video is worth your time. We're building awareness not just for the workplace, but for everywhere you go.
Let's start with a quick recap from the last 3 videos. In these past videos, we focus on 2 key principles of geotechnical stability: shear strength fundamentals. We explored how any rock fracture, joint, or potential failure plane relies on 2 main components to stay intact: cohesion, which is the rock's ability to stick together, and frictional resistance, which is its resistance to sliding. Together, these both determine whether a feature will remain stable or fail under stress.
Then we looked at the role of overlying load and geometry. This included reviewing how the material above, or besides a break or exposed surface, plays a critical role. If that load is well balanced and aligned with the underlying support, it can lock material in place. But if the weight is offset, or there's a lack of support on the exposed side, it can drive movement along weak planes and lead to failure.
Indeed, Jazz. Next, let's look at a practical example of how material load is distributed over an entire slope. Now, this might be a surface dump sitting on relatively flat ground, like a constructed waste rock facility, or it could be material placed within a pit where the base itself is sloped or angled. The way that load transfers through the material into the ground beneath it changes significantly depending on that underlying surface angle.
Let's imagine this hill, which is covered in vegetation, but underneath it's mostly just loose dirt, sediment, or sand, not solid rock, so it's like a mine dump. Now, if the hard ground beneath it is flat and level, then the load from the hill gets transferred straight down through the base. But here's the key point. The amount of load at the base depends entirely on how much material is stacked above that point. So, the thicker and heavier the overlying material, the greater the force being applied to the ground beneath it. It's not just about whether the base is flat, it's about how much weight is pushing down through that flat base. Even loose or weak material can remain stable if the base is strong and the overall weight isn't excessive. But once the overlying mass increases, so does the potential for settlement, compression, or failure at the base.
Now, if we imagine that same hill, but this time it's sitting on an inclined base, this changes how the weight is transferred. Instead of the load going directly down into the ground, part of that weight now gets directed downslope, following the angle of the surface beneath it. This means the material is no longer just pressing vertically, it's also trying to slide or move laterally. The steeper the incline of the underlying hard base, the more pronounced that downslope force becomes. And if the contact between the hill and the base is weak, say, it is made up of loose sediments on smooth bedrock, that material can start to shift or fail, especially if it gets wet or overloaded. So even if the surface looks stable, the geometry of the base plays a huge role in determining where the highest amount of load is transferring to and whether that hill will stay in place or start to move. This is also why, in a mining environment, if a downhill progressing waste dump intersects a laterally extensive weak band, such as a fault, clay seam, or bedding plane, it can act as a slip surface. Once that band is loaded from above, it may not be able to support the added stress. Instead, it can become a plane of weakness that allows the entire dump or slope to begin moving along it. If water is present or the weak layer is continuous across the slope, the risk of a large-scale failure significantly increases.
Now, let's take a look at a mine dump that's been built up in multiple levels or lifts stacked on top of each other. This is particularly relevant because at several sites, especially in some parts of the world, personnel are instructed to excavate material from the toe of waste dumps, often for use as road base, blast stemming, or other operational needs. But this can quickly become a hazard. If you think about how the load is transferred across the slope and the dump is sitting on flat ground, then the pressure from the overlying material is pushed vertically into the base. As long as you don't disturb the zones that are actively supporting that load, you wouldn't usually expect much instability. So, in flat ground conditions, if the dump material is uniform and well compacted, removing material at the toe that lies outside the overall slope angle, and therefore isn't structurally supporting the load, might not cause failure, especially if it's done in a controlled and shallow way. But, and this is the critical point, dumps are rarely, if ever, designed for this kind of excavation. So, removing any material from the base of a dump slope introduces potential hazards and is basically placing people directly in the line of fire when done without suitable geotechnical assessment. Even that stability depends entirely on the consistency, compaction, and cohesion of the dump material, which may not be known. If the material is loose, water-saturated, or layered with weaker zones, then even a small excavation near the toe can compromise the structure, especially if it creates a notch or removes confinement that was helping hold the slope in place. A larger excavation could result in a significant dump failure. As the more material that you remove that was supporting the overlying load, the more material that can fail. This is why you should never excavate at the toe of any slope without a prior geotechnical assessment. Now, you might argue, and fairly so, that you've done this plenty of times before and it's never been an issue. In fact, there might be areas of the dump where material near the toe has been excavated and the slope has stood unchanged for years. But that leads us to the first critical question. Where is the load actually being supported within the slope? And the next point is this. Could there be minerals or clays in the dump material that are creating a time-dependent cohesive bond? For example, in some mines, the dump material contains pyrite or fool's gold. When pyrite is exposed to air, it oxidizes, essentially forming a type of rust. And as we all know, rust can act as a weak cementing agent. It might hold things together for a while, but it's not reliable long-term. In other cases, clays within the dump may create cohesion. Again, though, this is not permanent, but enough to give the illusion of stability. So, if you've undercut the toe of a slope, and there is overlying material above that cut with no structural support, what you may have actually created is a time-dependent failure mechanism. It might not fail today or tomorrow, but given the right trigger, such as water ingress, vibration, or ongoing weathering, that material could let go without warning. And if it does, there likely won't be any controls in place, meaning the consequences could be substantial, depending on how much material was removed from the toe.
Now let's take a look at a basic animation that shows how this kind of failure can develop over time. We start with a vegetated hill. At first glance, it looks stable, but then the vegetation is removed, exposing the surface soil and allowing it to dry out, loosen, or become destabilized. The unvegetated hill is just the same as a mine dump for this analogy. Next, water enters the base of the slope, maybe through rainfall, runoff, or a nearby water source. Over time, this begins to soften the toe of the slope, especially if the material is made up of clays, loose sediments, or fill. Then comes the final trigger. Someone excavates material from the toe. By removing that lower support, the slope loses its base confinement. With a weakened toe, loosened surface, and the added effect of water, the slope fails, suddenly and possibly with little warning. This example shows how seemingly minor changes, layered over time, can combine to create a major hazard.
So then what happens if the slope, or waste dump, is sitting on an inclined base, like what you often see in some surface mines, particularly in coal mines? Well, this completely changes how the load is distributed. Instead of the weight being transferred directly downward into flat ground, now part of that load is being directed downslope along the plane of the inclined base. The steeper the angle, the more the weight starts to behave like a sliding mass, actively pushing toward the toe. So the load is no longer just sitting evenly across the bottom of the slope. It now creates significant load or pressure toward the downhill side of the overlying material. And that means any disturbance to the toe of the slope, especially on an inclined foundation, has a much higher risk of triggering a failure. You're not just removing material, you're removing the last line of resistance against that downward movement. This is why dumps placed on sloped ground need much more conservative design and management, particularly when it comes to drainage, toe excavation, or any loading near the slope face. Plus, if you excavate material from the downhill side of the slope, or if the toe is significantly weakened by factors like flood events that result in the bottom of the pit being submerged in water for an extended period, reducing the material's ability to support the load at that point, it could result in a larger, very significant failure. This is also why competent bunding, that is, a well-constructed bund made from strong, dense, angular rock, can be so effective when placed at the base of a slope or waste dump that's under downhill load. When you place a bund at the toe, and it's made from competent material, it acts like a barrier or retaining wedge. Its purpose is to resist the movement of any material that tries to slide or creep downslope. Here's how it works. The overlying material is trying to move downslope due to gravity. That force transfers through the body of the slope and concentrates at the toe. If you've got a bund in place, made of material strong enough to handle the load, it pushes back, adding passive resistance. This resistance helps counteract the downslope shear forces and can prevent or delay failure, particularly in situations where the slope is marginally stable. But the key is what the bund is made of. It needs to be well compacted, made from competent, strong, angular, interlocking rock, and properly placed at the zone of maximum load transfer, right at the base. Think of it as a mechanical buffer. If the material above begins to move, the bund provides a last line of defense to absorb and resist that force. It's not a guarantee against failure, but in many cases, it can stabilize the toe zone and buy time for inspection or remediation. But the downside is that it can take up a lot of room. So you do need to first ensure there is enough space in the design and that the bunding won't interfere with planned or recovery or mine infrastructure. As with every geotechnical hazard management strategy, this approach should always be assessed and managed by a geotechnical engineer to ensure it's fit for purpose and doesn't introduce new risks elsewhere. Ideally, this is reviewed and supported by the geotechnical team.
Now, we promised you some tips that aren't just useful for work, they actually apply anywhere you go. So, regardless of the environment you're in, you can remember it's all about the balance of the load and the material's ability to resist sliding or failing. So, with that in mind, one of the best early warning signs of geotechnical instability is simple. Something has changed. Although that change might be subtle. For example, you might suddenly notice lots of small rocks scattered across a haul road, whether in a surface mine or underground, or even on a coastal road or hiking track. This could be a sign that the stability of a slope or structure is changing, and the way the load was previously supported is starting to give way. Now yes, some failures can happen very suddenly, but many give us warning signs first. One of the most common early signs is the appearance of small rocks or debris. So why do we often see small rocks first? When a slope or wall begins to move, it's often the outer, weaker material, small rocks, dust, gravel, that loses cohesion or friction first. These smaller pieces are less confined, and they're typically the first to respond to subtle changes in stress, vibration, or moisture. As they roll or fall away, they remove the surface resistance that may have been helping to lock larger blocks in place. As more small pieces are lost, the supporting structure weakens, and this can allow larger rocks, which were previously held in place by friction, geometry, or the mass of material around them, to become unstable. So the progression usually goes: small rocks start rolling down, larger rocks begin to shift. Then, if the conditions continue to deteriorate, the whole slope or wall can let go. You can watch this play out over and over again in many landslide or slope failure videos online, as that pattern from small movement to larger collapse is common, whether it happens slowly or in a flash. You will see in online videos how people see small rocks falling down a slope and move closer to film them. This is not the right thing to do, especially if it's an early warning sign for a potentially much larger failure. The best course of action is to move as far away as safely possible, and even then, be aware, you may need to move again. So, if you're ever underground and suddenly see fresh rock on the ground that wasn't there before, stop and look up. Check for any signs of newly or freshly exposed rock surfaces. These typically don't have the same layer of dust on them as the surrounding rocks. In summary, they look much cleaner, even underground. That might be a useful warning that conditions are changing. Or if you're in a surface mine and spot new debris or changes on a slope again, look for changes to the normal pattern. And in both cases, if there's a potential hazard or any doubt, move away from the area and request a geotechnical inspection. It's not just a safety protocol, it's a potential lifesaver. But here's the most important thing to remember. Just because a slope hasn't failed today doesn't mean it won't. If there are zones where the load exceeds the material's ability to support it, failure can still happen. It might just take time. The longer it's left unaddressed, the more likely it is to fail suddenly, especially when the system reaches a tipping point. Take, for example, a coastal road where loose rocks keep appearing over the course of a year. That slope might look unchanged at a glance, but what's actually happening is slow deterioration. And if the failure mechanisms are in place and the material isn't strong enough to resist that load long term, then it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it will fail. So, whether you're underground or on the surface, if you see fresh rock that wasn't there before, stop, assess, and escalate as needed. Ask for a geotechnical inspection and move clear of the area if there's any doubt. Your awareness could make all the difference.
In this video, we explored how load behaves in real-world slopes and dumps, and what signs to watch for, whether you're on site or just out in the world. I hope you found it helpful and maybe even look at slopes and rocks a little differently now. We'll be back next week with more practical examples and insights, so make sure to check in again. Take care, stay safe, and see you for the next video.